The gravel crunched under the wheels of the Freightliner semi as it turned off County Road 14 onto the private drive of the Morrison Ranch. It was April 22nd, 1978, 9:47 in the morning, and Frank Dooley had been driving truck for 23 years. He knew this route. He'd delivered to farms and all across Marshall County, Iowa, and he'd learned to read the land the way some men read newspapers. The Morrison place sprawled across 720 acres of rolling prairie, bounded by oak trees his grandfather probably planted, and fence lines that ran straight as a rifle shot toward the horizon. On the flatbed behind him sat two brand-new John Deere 4640 tractors, still wrapped in protective plastic, their green and yellow paint gleaming in the spring sun. $92,000 worth of iron and steel and diesel power. The paperwork on the seat beside him said "Deliver to Michael Morrison," and Frank had no reason to think this would be anything but routine. He was wrong. 300 yards ahead, standing in the exact center of the gravel drive, was a man. 74 years old, judging by the gray hair and the weathered face, but standing with the posture of someone half that age. He wore faded denim overalls over a green work shirt, and over that, a field jacket that Frank recognized immediately. Army surplus, World War II vintage, the kind of jacket you earned by surviving things most men couldn't imagine. Frank eased off the accelerator. The air brakes hissed as the semi slowed to a crawl, then stopped 20 feet from where the old man stood. Frank leaned out the window, one hand still on the wheel. "Mr. Morrison," he called out, "I got your delivery." The old man didn't move. His arms hung loose at his sides, but there was something about the way he held himself that made Frank think of a door that wouldn't open no matter how hard you pushed. "Not my delivery," the old man said. His voice carried across the distance between them, flat and final as a judge's gavel. "My sons, and you're not bringing them onto this property." Frank blinked. He'd been doing this job long enough to know when a situation was about to get complicated, and every instinct he had was telling him this was one of those times. He pulled the clipboard from the passenger seat and squinted at the delivery order. "Sir," he said, "I got paperwork here. 2 John Deere 4640s ordered to Michael Morrison. Delivery address this location. It's all signed and approved." The old man took 3 steps forward. Not fast, not threatening, just steady. The kind of walk that said he'd cover whatever distance needed covering, and time wasn't going to change his mind. "I know what the paperwork says," the old man replied, "but this is my land, has been for 32 years, and those tractors aren't setting foot on it. You can turn that truck around and take them back to the dealership, or you can sit here until the sheriff comes. Your choice." Frank had delivered a lot of things to a lot of places, and he'd learned that the worst fights weren't the ones where people yelled. They were the ones where people got quiet and still, the way this old man was quiet and still right now. He reached for the radio mic. "Dispatch, this is Frank. I got a situation at the Morrison place. Need you to call Richmond Implement. Talk to Clay Richmond. We got a delivery dispute." The static crackled. "Copy that, Frank. Stand by." Frank killed the engine and climbed down from the cab. He'd spent enough time on farms to know you didn't stay in the truck when you were talking to the man who owned the land. The old man watched him approach, those gray eyes tracking every movement. "Mr. Morrison," Frank said, keeping his voice level and respectful, "I don't want any trouble here. I'm just doing my job. Your son ordered these tractors. They're paid for, well, financed, and I'm supposed to deliver them." The old man's expression didn't change. "I understand you're doing your job, son. I respect that. But I'm doing mine too. My job is protecting this land and the people on it. And right now, that means those tractors don't come through that gate." Frank heard the sound of a truck engine in the distance, coming fast down the county road. Within minutes, a silver Dodge pickup skidded to a stop behind the semi, and a man in his early 40s jumped out. Clay Richmond, dealership manager, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the John Deere logo embroidered over the pocket. He jogged up to where Frank and the old man stood. "Mr. Morrison," Clay said, a little breathless. "What's going on here?" The old man turned to face him, and Frank saw something shift in those gray eyes. Not anger exactly, something colder. "Clay," the old man said, "you sold my son $92,000 worth of equipment he doesn't need and can't afford. You did it knowing I'd never approve it. Now you can get back in your truck and get off my property, or I can explain to the whole county how you make your living." Clay's face flushed red. "Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, Mike is 36 years old. He's a grown man. He signed a binding contract. The old man nodded slowly. That's true, but the land he used as collateral belongs to me, and I'm refusing delivery. So unless you want to explain to your bosses how you financed a loan against disputed property, you'll load those tractors back up and drive them away. Another engine sound, this time a newer Ford pickup, pale blue, coming down the drive from the ranch house. It pulled up fast and a younger man got out. 36 years old with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and the kind of face that looked like it smiled often, but wasn't smiling now. He strode toward them, and Frank could see the family resemblance immediately. Same jaw, same way of carrying themselves. Father and son. Dad, the younger man said, what the hell are you doing? The old man didn't take his eyes off Clay Richmond. I'm stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life. These are my tractors, the son said, and his voice had an edge to it that made Frank take an involuntary step back. I ordered them. I signed for them. They're mine. They're the bank's tractors, the old man replied. You're just making payments on them, and they're not coming onto land that I own. You said I could run the farm. I said you could farm the land. I didn't say you could mortgage it. There's a difference, and you're about to learn it the hard way. Clay stepped between them, holding up both hands like a referee. Gentlemen, let's all just calm down here. Mr. Morrison, Hank, I understand your concerns. But Mike made a business decision. These tractors will increase productivity and reduce operating costs in the long run. The old man, Hank, turned to Clay with a look that could have melted steel. The kind of look Frank imagined he'd given enemy soldiers on some Pacific island 40 years ago. You sold my son a lie, Hank said. You sold him the same lie that killed your farm in '73. And you did it because you get a commission and you don't give a damn what happens to him after that check clears. Clay's jaw tightened. The contract is signed. The loan is approved. These tractors are legally purchased. Hank nodded again. That same slow nod. That may be true, but the delivery address is my property and I'm refusing delivery. So unless you want to sue me for breach of a contract I'm not party to, you can load those tractors back up, or Mike can rent ground somewhere else to park them. But they're not staying here. Mike, the son, stepped closer to his father, close enough that Frank could see the tendons standing out in his neck, the way his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. You want to control me forever, Mike said. I'm 36 years old and you still treat me like I'm 12. I want to save you from yourself. From what? From success? From progress? From losing everything because you were too proud to learn from history. A fourth vehicle arrived, this one a Brown County Sheriff's cruiser with the light bar on top. An older man in uniform climbed out, hitching his belt up over a considerable belly. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd broken up more than his share of disputes. Hank, he called out, what's going on? Tom, Hank replied without turning around. These men are trying to deliver equipment to my property against my wishes. The sheriff, Tom, walked over and took the clipboard from Frank's hands. He read through the paperwork, then looked at Mike. Mike, you signed this? Yes, sir. Hank, you own this land? Yes, sir. Tom handed the clipboard back to Frank. This is a civil matter. I can't force anybody to accept delivery on their own property. Frank, if Mr. Morrison here is refusing, you're going to have to take it up with the dealership and the buyer about alternate arrangements. Clay pulled out his cell phone, one of those big brick types that were just starting to become common. He turned away and had a conversation Frank couldn't quite hear. When he came back, his face had gone from red to pale. Mike, Clay said, we can work this out. We'll take the tractors back to the lot for now. You can arrange alternate storage, and we'll deliver there instead. Mike stood very still. Frank had seen that look before on men who just realized they'd walked into something they couldn't walk back out of. The moment when pride ran headlong into reality, and neither one was willing to back down. Fine, Mike said. Take them to Bud Keller's place. I'll rent his barn. Hank watched his son, and Frank saw something in the old man's face that wasn't anger or triumph. It was sadness. Deep sadness. The kind that comes from watching someone you love make a choice you can't protect them from. Bud Keller's 5 miles from here, Hank said quietly. You'll drive 10 miles a day just to get to and from your equipment. That's 3 hours a week you'll never get back. And that's before you start counting what it costs. It's my choice, Mike replied. It is, Hank agreed. And I hope you can live with it. Frank climbed back into the cab of the Freightliner and started the engine. As he began the complicated process of backing the semi down the narrow drive toward the county road, He watched in his mirrors as Mike got into his truck and drove away, and Hank stood there alone in the middle of the road, still and quiet as a gravestone. Frank had been driving truck for 23 years. He'd delivered a lot of things to a lot of places, but he knew, watching that old man standing there, that he'd just witnessed something that would be told and retold in this county for years to come. The day Hank Morrison stood in the road and stopped $92,000 worth of iron with nothing but his word and his will. He just didn't know yet whether it would be told as the story of a stubborn old man who couldn't let go, or the story of a father who loved his son enough to let him be angry if it meant keeping him safe. Time would answer that question. Time and debt and the price of corn and the weight of pride. The semi rolled back onto County Road 14, and Frank shifted into gear, heading back toward town with two brand new tractors that nobody wanted and everybody would remember. To understand what happened that April morning, you have to go back to when Hank Morrison was 8 years old and learned the lesson that would define the rest of his life. It was 1932, the heart of the Great Depression, and the Morrison family farm was dying. Hank's father, Jacob Morrison, was a good man and a decent farmer, but he'd made one mistake. Just one. In 1928, when times were good and wheat was selling for $1.30 a bushel, he'd borrowed $3,000 to buy a new tractor and expand his operation from 80 acres to 240. The banker told him it was smart business. The implement dealer told him he couldn't afford not to modernize. His neighbors told him he was being progressive, forward-thinking. Then the stock market crashed in October of 29, and wheat prices fell like stones thrown down a well. $1.30 became 90 cents, became 60 cents, became 40 cents. By the spring of 32, Jacob Morrison was selling wheat for less than it cost to grow it, and the bank came calling for its money. Young Hank stood on the porch and watched men in suits load their furniture onto a truck. His mother stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, and didn't cry because there weren't any tears left. His father stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets, staring at dirt that his father had homesteaded and his grandfather had died defending in the Civil War. "Where are we going?" Hank had asked his mother. "Town," she'd said. "We're going to town. But this is our home." "Not anymore." They moved into a boarding house in town, 3 rooms for 5 people, and Jacob took work wherever he could find it. Road crews, harvest labor, anything that paid. Hank watched his father age 10 years and 10 months, watched the light go out of his eyes. He listened at night when his parents thought he was asleep, heard his mother crying and his father's voice, rough with shame. "I borrowed $3,000, Jacob would say. "That's all. Just $3,000. Now we got nothing." Nothing. Young Hank made a promise to himself that night, lying on a cot in a room that smelled like other people's cooking and other people's despair. He promised that if he ever got land of his own, he would never, ever borrow money. He would rather die poor than die owing. 14 years later, in 1946, Hank Morrison came home from the war. He'd left Iowa as a 20-year-old farm boy and come back as a 24-year-old man who'd seen things that would wake him up sweating for the next 50 years. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, places where the sand ran red and the air smelled like copper and cordite. He'd watched friends die, had killed men himself, and he'd learned something about himself that he carried with him always. He could survive anything as long as he didn't owe anyone anything. He'd saved $1,200 from 3 years of military pay. Every dollar he didn't spend on cigarettes or whiskey or the kind of fun his buddies blew their money on, he saved. He came home with that money in a canvas bag, and he went looking for land. Most people thought he was crazy. The good land around town was selling for $60, $70 an acre, and that was for flat, black dirt that grew corn like it was trying to prove something. Hank couldn't afford that. Instead, he found 80 acres of sandhills 10 miles outside of town that nobody wanted. Rolling, rocky ground that barely grew grass, let alone crops. The owner wanted $15 an acre, and Hank offered $12. They settled on $13.50. Hank bought those 80 acres for $1,080 and had $120 left over. He used $60 to buy a used plow and a used disc. He used another $60 to buy seed, and he spent $400 on a 1938 John Deere Model B tractor that looked like it had been through the war with him. His neighbors laughed. Hank Morrison, trying to farm sandhills with a tractor, older than his marriage prospects. But Hank didn't care what his neighbors thought. He cared about one thing: the land was his. All his. Nobody could take it away because nobody had a claim on it. That first year, he barely grew enough to feed himself. The second year was better. The third year, he figured out that the sandy soil, while poor for corn, could grow certain things well if you knew how to work with it instead of against it. Alfalfa, pasture grass. He bought 3 beef cattle with money he'd saved. Then 5, then 10. Every year he saved half of what he made. Every year, he put that money in a coffee can in the kitchen, and when the can was full, he'd take it to the bank and put it in an account that earned 2% interest. Not to borrow against, just to save. He met Ruth Henning at a church social in 1948. She was the daughter of a hardware store owner, a practical woman with steady hands and eyes that didn't look away when things got hard. She'd lost a brother in the war and a father to a heart attack, and she understood that life was something you built carefully, one day at a time, $1 at a time. They married in the spring of '49, and Ruth moved into the small house Hank had built on his 80 acres. She worked beside him, drove the tractor when he was fixing fence, kept the books because she was better with numbers than he'd ever be. At night, they'd sit at the kitchen table and plan. In 5 years, Hank would say, "We'll have enough for another 80 acres. Ruth would nod. If we save 40% instead of 30, we could do it in 4. They did it in 4. By 1953, Hank Morrison owned 160 acres, debt-free. He was 31 years old. Some of his neighbors owned more land, but they also owned debt. Hank owned less, but slept better. In 1956, Ruth got pregnant. She was 34 years old, and they'd both started to think it might not happen. When Michael was born in February of '57, Hank held his son and made the same kind of promise he'd made to himself at 8 years old. This boy would inherit land, not debt. This boy would never know the shame of losing a home because of money owed. Hank kept farming, kept saving, kept buying land when he had cash and the price was right. By 1961, he had 400 acres. By 1970, 720. All of it paid for, all of it his. He taught Michael to drive the tractor when the boy was 8, taught him to fix engines when he was 10, taught him that the land would provide if you respected it and didn't ask it for more than it could give. But Michael was growing up in a different world than the one Hank had known. This was the 1960s and 70s, and everywhere you looked, people were talking about progress and growth and the new American agriculture. Bigger farms, bigger equipment, bigger yields. The agriculture department sent agents to farms to preach the gospel of modernization. The banks offered loans at rates that seemed reasonable. The implement dealers had tractors with air conditioning and stereos and enough horsepower to pull a house off its foundation. Michael soaked it all in. He was smart, smarter than Hank in some ways, and he wanted to use that intelligence. He went to Iowa State University and majored in agricultural economics. He came home with a head full of theories about capital efficiency and economies of scale and leveraging assets. Hank listened and said little. He remembered his own father, educated by hardship, learning that theory was what you believed until reality showed you different. Ruth died in the spring of 1973, cancer that started in her lungs and spread before the doctors could do anything about it. Hank buried her in the cemetery outside of town, next to a plot he'd already bought for himself. Michael came home from college for the funeral, stayed a week, then went back to finish his degree. Hank was 67 years old, alone on 720 acres with memories and machines and a bone-deep certainty that what he built mattered, that it meant something, that his son would understand someday why debt was poison and why the only real security was land you owned outright. He didn't know, not yet, that his son saw things differently, that Michael had heard different voices, believed different prophets, that the collision between them was coming as sure as spring followed winter. Michael graduated in 1974 and came home to farm. For a few years, it worked. They farmed together, father and son, using Hank's methods and Hank's equipment. The harvests were good, corn prices were decent, they netted enough to live on and save a little. But Michael chafed at the pace. The old equipment broke down. Parts were hard to find. The tractors were slow compared to the new models. He'd visit neighbors who'd modernized, see them covering ground twice as fast, and come home frustrated. "Why can't we upgrade?" he'd ask. "Because new costs money we don't have," Hank would reply. "We could borrow." And there it was, the word that separated them, borrow. "No," Hank would say, "we don't borrow." "Dad, it's 1976. Everybody borrows." That's how you grow. That's how you lose everything. They'd argue about it over dinner, over breakfast, in the fields while they worked. The same argument, over and over, like a song stuck on repeat. Michael wanted to expand, to modernize, to compete. Hank wanted to protect what they had. In March of 1978, Hank's knees finally gave out. 74 years old and the cartilage was gone, ground down to bone on bone from 50 years of climbing on and off tractors, kneeling in dirt, walking behind plows. The doctor said surgery might help, but recovery would take months, and at his age, there were no guarantees. Hank called Michael into the barn on a cold morning when frost still clung to the grass and their breath made clouds in the air. "I'm done," Hank said. "Not dead, but done. My knees won't take another season. Time for you to run the operation." Michael's face lit up the way it used to when he was a boy, and Christmas morning arrived. Finally, his chance to do things the way he'd learned at college, the way the progressive farmers did it. But Hank wasn't finished. "There's a condition," he said. "You farm this land, but you farm it my way. No debt. You want new equipment, you save for it. This ranch stays debt-free. That's the deal." And Michael's face fell. The light went out of his eyes, replaced by something harder. Resentment, maybe. Or rebellion. "So I work twice as hard with equipment from the 60s, Michael said. "You work smart, not hard. I'm 36 years old. When do I get to make my own decisions?" "When you own the land," Hank replied. "Right now I do." Michael had turned and walked away without another word, his boots crunching on the gravel, his shoulders tight with anger. Hank watched him go and felt the weight of something breaking between them, something that might not get fixed. But Hank didn't change his mind, couldn't change it, because he remembered being 8 years old and watching men in suits load furniture onto a truck, and he remembered his father's voice in the dark, saying $3,000. That's all, just 3,000, and now we got nothing. Some lessons you learned once and carried forever. For Hank Morrison, that was the lesson. Debt was death, slow and sure, and he'd be damned if he'd watch his son learn it the way his father had. So when Michael went to the dealership without telling him, when he signed the papers and arranged the delivery, Hank knew. He always knew. You don't farm the same land for 30 years without developing an instinct for when something's wrong. That morning, April 22nd, when Hank was supposed to be at the Veterans Hall for the monthly breakfast, his instinct told him to stay home. He saw the semi-truck turn off the county road, saw the sun glinting off the green and yellow paint of the tractors on the flatbed, and he knew exactly what his son had done. And he walked out into the middle of that gravel drive and stood his ground, because that's what you did when you love someone enough to save them from themselves. Even if it meant they'd hate you for it, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant breaking your son's heart to save his future. Hank Morrison was 74 years old, and he'd survived the Great Depression and the Second World War and the death of everyone he'd loved except his son. He could survive this too. He had to, because some battles you fought not to win, but to make sure the people you loved didn't lose. And this was one of those battles. The dust settled on County Road 14 as Frank Dooley's semi disappeared toward town, hauling $92,000 worth of pride and anger. Hank Morrison stood alone in the middle of the gravel drive for a long time after everyone had gone. The spring wind moved through the oak trees his grandfather had planted, and somewhere in the distance, a red-tailed hawk called out hunting the fields. Sheriff Tom Anderson had left first, shaking his head and muttering something about stubborn Morrisons. Clay Richmond had peeled out in his silver Dodge, gravel spraying from his tires like accusations, and Mike had driven away without looking back, his blue Ford kicking up a rooster tail of dust that hung in the air long after the sound of his engine faded. Hank turned and walked back toward the house, moving slow because his knees hurt and because there was no reason to hurry anymore. The damage was done. The line was drawn, father and son on opposite sides of something that couldn't be unsaid or undone. Inside the kitchen, the coffee pot was still warm from breakfast. Hank poured himself a cup and sat at the table where he and Ruth had planned their future 40 years ago, where they'd taught Michael his numbers and his letters, where they'd celebrated harvests and mourned losses. The wood was scarred from years of use, circles from hot cups and scratches from homework, and one long gouge from the time 5-year-old Michael had tried to carve his name with a pocket knife. Hank traced that gouge with his finger now, remembering the sound of Ruth's voice when she'd caught their son. "Michael James Morrison, you put that knife down right now." And Michael's face, defiant even then, asking why. Because I said so, Ruth had answered, and that had been enough. When had it stopped being enough? When had his words stopped mattering to his son? The phone on the wall rang, loud and jarring. Hank let it ring 6 times before he got up to answer it. "Hank," a voice said. "Reverend Thomas Wade, the pastor at First Methodist. I heard about this morning." "Word travels fast," Hank said. "Small town. I ran into Tom Anderson at the hardware store. He told me what happened. Then you know as much as I do." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Hank could hear papers rustling, the sound of someone settling into a chair. "I was calling to see if you needed someone to talk to." "Appreciate it, Tom, but I'm fine." "Are you?" Hank looked out the window at the barn, the equipment shed, the fields stretching toward the horizon. Everything he'd built, everything he'd protected, everything he was trying to pass on to a son who didn't want it the way it was. "I did what I had to do," Hank said. "I know you did. But I also know what it costs when you have to choose between being right and being close to someone you love. Being right matters when being wrong means losing everything." Reverend Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be praying for you both. And Hank, if Mike needs to talk, my door's open." "He won't come." "Maybe not, but the offer stands." They said their goodbyes and Hank hung up the phone. He stood there for a while, hands still on the receiver, thinking about the last time he'd been in church. Ruth's funeral, 5 years ago. He hadn't been back since. Wasn't sure God listened to men who stood in the road and broke their sons' hearts, even if they did it for the right reasons. 5 miles away, at Bud Keller's farm, Mike Morrison watched as Frank Dooley's semi backed carefully into the barn that would now house his tractors. The barn was old, built sometime in the 40s, with a hayloft that sagged and walls that let light through the gaps between boards. Not the kind of place you wanted to store $92,000 worth of equipment, but it was what he had. Bud Keller stood beside him, a man in his late 60s with a weathered face and hands that trembled slightly when he wasn't using them. He'd been farming since before Mike was born, had modernized early, bought new equipment on credit back in '75 when the loans were cheap and the future looked bright. "Hell of a thing," Bud said, watching the tractors roll off the trailer. "Your old man stopping the delivery like that." Mike didn't answer. His jaw was so tight it hurt. "You know he means well," Bud continued. "He's just old school, doesn't understand how things work now." "He understands," Mike said. "He just doesn't care." Frank Dooley climbed down from the cab and walked over with the paperwork. Mike signed where Frank pointed, and that made it official. 2 John Deere 4640 tractors, brand new, stored in a barn that belonged to someone else, 5 miles from the land they were supposed to work. "You need anything," Bud said. "You let me know." I remember what it was like being young and trying to make my own way. My old man was the same way. Thought debt was the devil. But look at me. I borrowed in '75 and I'm doing just fine. Mike nodded, but he wasn't really listening. He was calculating distances and time and how much of his life he was going to spend driving back and forth, like some kind of punishment for wanting to build something bigger than what his father had given him. "Storage is $400 a month," Bud said. "That fair?" "That's fair." They shook hands, and Frank Dooley drove away with an empty trailer, and Mike stood in the dim barn looking at $92,000 worth of green and yellow metal that gleamed like promise but felt like chains. The first month wasn't so bad. Mike got into a routine. Up at 5, drive to Bud's place by 5:30, hook up whatever implement he needed, drive back to the Morrison place, work the fields, drive back to Bud's at the end of the day, park the tractor, drive home. 10 miles a day. Sometimes 15, depending on what needed doing. The tractors performed beautifully. They were everything Clay Richmond had promised. Powerful, efficient, comfortable. The cab had air conditioning and a radio, and Mike could cover ground twice as fast as his father's old 4010. He planted all 720 acres in 3 weeks, half the time it would have taken with the old equipment. See, he told himself, this was the right decision. The numbers would prove it. The harvest would prove it, his father would see. But there were costs he hadn't calculated. The diesel for all that driving back and forth, the wear on his truck, the 3 hours a day he spent behind the wheel instead of in the field. And then there was the storage fee, $400 a month that came due whether he used the tractors or not. And there was something else, something harder to measure. The way neighbors looked at him now, the way conversations stopped when he walked into the feed store, the way people asked, heard about the trouble with your dad, and then waited to see what he'd say. Mike said nothing, kept his head down, did his work, made his payments. The first payment was due May 15th, $1,210. He wrote the check and mailed it 3 days early, wanting to prove to himself and anyone who might ask that he could handle this. June came hot and dry. The corn sprouted green and eager, but the sky stayed cloudless day after day. The forecast called for rain that never arrived. In the fields, the young plants started to show stress, leaves curling slightly at the edges, growth slowing. Mike walked the rows and told himself it was normal. Early season drought happened sometimes. The rain would come, it always did. But at night, lying awake in the small house his father had built for him when he'd come back from college, he ran numbers in his head. If the rain didn't come, if the yields dropped, if the corn price fell, he pushed those thoughts away. Focused on what he could control, he'd planted on time, done everything right. The rest was up to weather and markets, and worrying about them wouldn't change anything. Bud Keller stopped by one evening in late June, driving slow up the lane in his old International pickup. He found Mike in the machine shed, changing oil in his own truck by the light of a work lamp. "Got a minute?" Bud asked. Mike wiped his hands on a rag. "Sure." They walked out into the yard where the evening light was turning everything gold and long shadows stretched across the ground. Bud pulled a pack of cigarettes from his shirt pocket, offered one to Mike, who declined, then lit one for himself. "I need to tell you something," Bud said, and his voice had a weight to it that made Mike pay attention. "I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The financial kind, the 75 kind." Mike waited. Bud took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaled smoke that hung in the still air. "When I bought my equipment in 75, Bud said, the loan was at 8.5%. Seemed reasonable. I could handle the payments, figured I'd pay it down over time. But rates have been climbing. Last month, they adjusted my loan to 11%. My payment went from $1,450 a month to $1,680. "That's rough," Mike said. "That's not the worst part. The worst part is I can't make it. Even at $1,450, I was barely covering it. At $1,680, there's no way. Not with corn at $215, not with this drought cutting into yields." Mike felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Can you refinance?" "I tried. Banks won't touch me. They say I'm overextended. They say they need to see a profitable year before they'll consider it. But I can't have a profitable year when I'm paying $1,680 a month on equipment." "What are you going to do?" Bud flicked ash from his cigarette. "I don't know. Try to make it through harvest, I guess. Hope for a miracle. But Mike, I'm telling you this because you need to understand something. The game's changing. Interest rates are going up, not down. The Fed's trying to control inflation, and they're doing it by making money expensive. You're 8.75%. That could be 10% next year, 12 the year after." "That won't happen," Mike said, but his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. "You're a smart kid," Bud said. "Smarter than me. But sometimes being smart isn't enough. Sometimes you get caught in something bigger than you are, and all the intelligence in the world won't save you." He dropped the cigarette and ground it out with his boot. "Anyway, just thought you should know. I'm probably going to have to give up the barn storage. Can't afford it anymore. I'll give you through the end of July to find somewhere else." Mike watched Bud drive away, the taillights of the International disappearing down the lane, and felt the first real stab of fear. Not panic, not yet, just fear. The quiet kind that sits in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. He went back to changing the oil in his truck, but his hands weren't as steady as they'd been before. July burned across Iowa like a furnace. 95 degrees, 98, 102. The corn stood in the fields, stunted and struggling, leaves turning brown at the tips. The county extension agent came by and looked at Mike's crops and suggested increasing the nitrogen application, pushing the plants to grow despite the drought. Mike followed the advice, bought another 2 tons of fertilizer on credit, spread it across the fields, watched and waited for improvement. The improvement didn't come. Instead, the corn started showing signs of nitrogen burn, too much fertilizer and not enough water, the chemicals concentrating in the soil and stressing the plants even more. He called the extension agent back. The man walked the rows again, pulled up a plant, examined the roots. "You might want to back off the nitrogen," the agent said. "You told me to increase it." "I know. But with this drought, I think we overcorrected. The plants can't process it all." "Can I fix it?" "Not really. You'll just have to ride it out. Hope for rain." Mike stood in the field after the agent left, surrounded by 720 acres of corn that was supposed to save his reputation and prove his father wrong, and watched the sky for clouds that weren't there. The phone call came on July 18th. Richmond Implement, the dealership, calling to inform him that his John Deere 4640 had a warranty issue. Mike drove to Bud's barn, fired up the tractor, and immediately heard the problem. A grinding noise from the engine, deep and wrong. He nursed the tractor to the dealership, driving slow, praying it wouldn't quit on him. The service manager, a younger guy who'd replaced someone Mike used to know, listened to the engine and shook his head. Turbocharger, he said. Sounds like the bearings are going. That's covered under warranty, right? Should be. Let me check. He disappeared into the office. 20 minutes later, he came back with a clipboard and a sympathetic expression that Mike immediately didn't trust. Here's the thing, the service manager said. The warranty covers defects in materials and workmanship, but this looks like a maintenance issue. You're supposed to let the engine cool down before shutting it off. Prevents oil from cooking in the turbo bearings. Says so right in the manual. I've been shutting it off at the end of the day, Mike said. Like you do. How long are you letting it idle first? I don't know, a minute maybe. Manual recommends 5 minutes at low idle after hard use. This is considered operator error, so it's not covered. Mike felt heat rise in his face. How much to fix it? Parts and labor. $6,800. $6,800. For a tractor that was supposed to make his life easier. That was supposed to pay for itself. That was sitting in someone else's barn because his father wouldn't let it on the land it was meant to work. Mike didn't have $6,800. He had maybe $3,200 in his checking account, and that was supposed to cover expenses until harvest. He went to the bank, First National, where he'd gotten his original loan, asked to speak with the loan officer. Warren Hastings was 55 years old, thin and precise, with reading glasses that he wore in a chain around his neck. He invited Mike into his office, offered coffee that Mike declined, and listened while Mike explained the situation. I need a short-term note, Mike said. $6,800. I'll pay it back after harvest. Warren tapped his pen against the desk. Let me pull up your file. He typed something into the computer on his desk, one of the new IBM models that were showing up in businesses across the county. His eyes moved back and forth, reading information Mike couldn't see. Okay, Warren said. Here's what I'm seeing. You've got your primary equipment loan, $92,000 originally. You've made one payment, so you're at about $90,800. You've got 720 acres as collateral, valued at approximately $1.4 million. Your debt-to-asset ratio is reasonable. So you'll do it? I'll do it, but at 14% for 90 days. That's the best I can offer. The Fed's raising rates and we have to protect our position. 14%, Mike repeated. That's almost double what I'm paying on the tractor loan. Short-term unsecured notes carry higher risk. If you can't pay it back in 90 days, the rate goes to 18% and we'll need to discuss restructuring. Mike signed the papers because he didn't have a choice. $6,800 at 14% interest. The monthly payment wasn't terrible, but the principal that he'd have to repay in 3 months sat on his shoulders like a physical weight. He paid the dealership and got his tractor back 3 days later. It ran smooth again, quiet, powerful. But every time Mike climbed into the cab, he thought about the $6,800, and the tractor felt less like a tool and more like a burden. August arrived with no break in the heat. The corn stood in the fields, shorter than it should be, the ears smaller than they ought to be. Mike walked the rows and estimated yields. 108 bushels per acre if he was lucky. He'd projected 125. That 17 bushel difference, multiplied across 720 acres, was the difference between comfortable and squeezed. The corn price had dropped too, $2.15 in June, $2.05 in August. Futures were trending down as harvest approached, and the market anticipated supply. Mike ran the numbers every night, sitting at his kitchen table with a calculator and a notepad, trying to make the math work. 720 acres times 108 bushels per acre. 77,760 bushels, times $2.05 per bushel, $159,408 gross. Operating costs were running higher than expected. Diesel, fertilizer, chemicals, seed, the extra fertilizer he'd bought in July. He was into it for about $95,000, maybe a little more. That left $64,000 before loan payments. Equipment loan, annual, $14,520. The repair loan due in November, $6,800 plus interest. Storage at Bud's, $4,800 for the year so far. He subtracted and subtracted and subtracted, and at the bottom of the page, the number that remained was $39,680, less than $40,000, on 720 acres. He'd worked every day from April through August, driven thousands of miles, spent $92,000 on equipment, and he was going to net less than $40,000. His father, farming the same land with paid for equipment, had netted $48,000 the year before. Mike sat at that table until past midnight, staring at the numbers, trying to find the mistake. But there was no mistake. Just reality, cold and mathematical, and completely indifferent to his pride or his plans or his need to prove something to a 74-year-old man who tried to stop him. He finally went to bed but didn't sleep. Lay there in the dark, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, thinking about debt and weather and the price of corn and the feeling of being trapped in something he'd built himself. Harvest began the third week of September. Mike hired a custom cutter to bring in the corn because buying a combine would have put him even deeper in debt, and even he could see that that would be insane. The combine rolled through his fields, eating up the stunted corn, spitting out grain that poured into the waiting trucks. 106 bushels per acre. Final tally, 2 bushels less than he'd hoped. He sold most of it right away, couldn't afford to store it, and hoped for better prices. $2 flat per bushel. The market had continued to slide through September, and by the time his crop was in the bin, that was the going rate. Final gross revenue, $153,120. After operating costs, $58,120. After loan payments and storage, $36,800. Mike had farmed 720 acres with brand new equipment and modern techniques, and he'd netted less in 1 year than most men made working for the county road department. He wrote the check for the repair loan in November, $6,800 plus $240 in interest. That left him with $28,360. Living expenses for the year, property taxes, insurance, the cost of keeping a house and a truck, and himself alive. Call it $12,000. That left $16,360. Less than $17,000 for a year of work, for the privilege of proving his father wrong. Except he hadn't proven his father wrong. He'd proven him right, and that was worse than any dollar amount. The night he finished his accounting, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd done his homework as a boy, Mike put his head down on his arms and cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that soaked into his shirt sleeves and made him feel like he was 8 years old again, and something bad had happened, and he didn't know how to fix it. His father's house sat a quarter mile away, lights on in the kitchen, smoke rising from the chimney. Mike could see it from his window, had seen it every day of his life. It had always felt close, but tonight it felt like it was on the other side of a canyon too wide to cross. The phone rang. Mike wiped his face and answered it. "Mike," a voice said. "Reverend Wade, I wanted to check on you." "I'm fine. Are you?" "Why does everyone keep asking me that?" "Because people care about you. And because I saw Bud Keller at the church potluck last week. He told me about his situation. And I know you stored your equipment at his place." Mike didn't say anything. "He's losing his farm, Mike. The bank's foreclosing. They'll auction everything in March. I imagine that affects you." "It does," Mike said. "Where will you move the tractors?" "I don't know. Have you talked to your father?" "No. Maybe it's time. Maybe it's not," Mike said. And hung up the phone. But he knew Reverend Wade was right. He knew it the way you know it's going to rain when your joints ache, the way you know winter's coming when the geese fly south. He couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep bleeding money and time and pride. Couldn't keep driving 10 miles a day to use equipment that was supposed to make him more efficient, but was actually making him poor. He needed help, needed his father, needed to swallow every bit of pride and anger and resentment and ask for what he should have accepted in the first place. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight, he sat in the dark and felt the weight of debt pressing down on him, and understood for the first time what his father had been trying to tell him. It wasn't about the money, it was about the freedom, about being able to make choices because you wanted to, not because you had to, about sleeping at night without the sound of interest accruing in your head like a clock that never stopped ticking. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Winter was coming, and Mike Morrison, 36 years old, educated and ambitious and determined to be his own man, sat alone in a house he didn't own on land that belonged to his father, and wondered how he'd gotten so lost. The answer, of course, was simple. He'd stopped listening, had stopped believing that the old ways might be the right ways, had trusted the wrong voices and ignored the one voice that had never steered him wrong. And now he was paying for it, would keep paying for it, unless he could find the courage to do what every part of his pride said he shouldn't do. Go home, admit he was wrong, ask for help. The lights in his father's house stayed on past midnight. Mike watched them from his window and wondered if Hank was sitting at his own table, doing his own calculations, arriving at his own conclusions about his son and stubbornness and the price of being right. Maybe tomorrow, Mike thought. Maybe tomorrow I'll drive over there, sit down, talk. But tomorrow came and he didn't go, and the day after that, and the day after that. Winter settled over Iowa like a gray blanket, and two men who loved each other stayed in their separate houses, separated by a quarter-mile and $92,000, and pride that neither one knew how to set aside, until they had no choice, until the weight of silence became heavier than the weight of words, until standing alone hurt more than admitting you were wrong. January came to Iowa the way it always did, cold and mean and indifferent to human concerns. The fields lay frozen under snow that fell in the night and stayed through the day, accumulating in drifts against fence lines and buildings. Mike Morrison woke each morning in a house that never seemed warm enough. No matter how high he turned the thermostat, and drove roads that were more ice than asphalt to check on equipment he couldn't afford to use. The tractors sat in Bud Keller's barn, cold and silent, their green paint dulled by a thin layer of dust. Mike had tried to start them once in December just to keep the batteries charged and the fuel from gelling, but the barn had no heat and the diesel engines were stubborn in the cold. It took 40 minutes and a set of jumper cables to get the first one running, and by the time he was done, his hands were numb and his breath was white clouds in the air. He didn't try again after that, just let them sit, monuments to ambition and mistakes, waiting for spring that felt like it would never come. The payment was due January 15th, $1,210. Mike wrote the check and stared at it for a long time before sealing the envelope. 2 payments down, 118 to go. 10 years of this. 120 months of writing checks for equipment that sat unused half the year in someone else's barn. The math haunted him. 1,210 times 118, $142,780 for tractors that had cost $92,000. He was going to pay $50,780 in interest over the life of the loan. $50,000 for the privilege of owning something that was depreciating every day. His father's voice echoed in his head, unbidden and unwelcome. When the bank owns your tractor, they own your balls. Mike understood that now in a way he hadn't in April. Understood that every decision he made, every plan he tried to form, had to account first for that $1,210. The payment came before food, before repairs, before anything. Miss one payment and the whole structure collapsed. He mailed the check and drove home through snow that was starting to fall again, fat flakes that stuck to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. The radio played country music, songs about heartbreak and hard times, and Mike turned it off because he didn't need someone else's sadness added to his own. February was worse, the kind of month that made you forget spring existed. Temperatures stayed below zero for days at a time. The pipes in Mike's house froze twice. The truck wouldn't start one morning, and he had to call a neighbor for a jump. Everything cost money he didn't have, and the checking account balance dropped like a rock thrown in a well. On February 10th, a letter arrived from Richmond Implement. Mike opened it, standing at the mailbox, snow falling around him, and read the words that made his stomach drop. Dear Mr. Morrison, this letter is to inform you that Clay Richmond is no longer employed by Richmond Implement. Effective immediately, all sales accounts will be transferred to our new regional manager. If you have questions about your equipment loan or service needs, please contact our main office. Mike drove to town that afternoon, found Clay Richmond at the bar on Main Street, sitting alone at 2 in the afternoon with a whiskey in front of him and the look of a man who'd run out of places to go. They fired you, Mike said, sliding onto the stool next to him. Clay looked at him with eyes that were red around the edges. Not just fired, blackballed, can't get work anywhere in the industry. Turns out when you sell equipment to farmers who can't make payments, it reflects poorly on your judgment. I'm making my payments. You're one of 3. Out of 17 sales I made in 77 and 78, 14 are in default or headed that way. The dealership's reputation has taken a hit. They needed someone to blame. I was convenient. Clay drained his whiskey and signaled the bartender for another. The bartender, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, poured and moved away without comment. I got a kid, Clay said. 17 years old, wants to go to college. I was supposed to have money saved for that, but I got nothing, less than nothing. I got debt of my own. What are you going to do? Clay laughed, but there was no humor in it. Find work, any work. I saw a help wanted sign at the high school, janitor position, $12 an hour. I used to make $60,000 a year selling tractors. Now I'm going to mop floors. Mike didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to feel vindicated, wanted to see Clay's fall as justice for the sales pitch that had gotten him into this mess. But sitting next to the man, seeing the defeat in his shoulders and the shake in his hands, Mike felt only sadness. They were both casualties of the same war, just on different fronts. I'm sorry, Mike said. For what? For how this turned out. Clay picked up his fresh whiskey, but didn't drink it. Just held the glass and looked at the amber liquid like it might contain answers. You know what the worst part is? Clay asked. I believed it. Everything I told you, I believed. I thought I was helping. Thought modern equipment and smart financing were the path to success. I sold you a dream I believed in. He finally drank, a small sip that he held in his mouth before swallowing. Turns out it was a lie. Your dad knew it. My dad probably knew it. But we didn't want to believe them because they were old and we were young and we thought we were smarter. Mike left the bar and drove home through gray afternoon light that made everything look tired. He thought about Clay mopping floors at the high school where he'd probably graduated 30 years ago. Thought about the 17-year-old kid who wanted to go to college. Thought about dreams and lies and the distance between them. The call came on March 3rd, late morning. Bud Keller's voice on the phone, thick and rough, the sound of a man who'd been crying. Mike, he said, it's done. Bank's taking everything. Auction set for March 15th. I'm sorry, Bud. Yeah, me too. Look, you need to get your equipment out of here. I can give you till the 10th, but after that, the bank takes possession of the property and anything on it. They'll auction your tractors with mine if you don't move them. Where am I supposed to take them? That's not my problem anymore. I don't have any more problems. Bank's taking care of all of them. Bud hung up. Mike sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, feeling the weight of a new crisis settle on top of all the others. 7 days to find storage for 2 tractors. 7 days to figure out how to move them in winter weather. 7 days to solve a problem that shouldn't exist because the equipment should have been on his own land from the beginning. He called Brown Egarnon. Every barn in the county was either full or the owner wanted more than he could afford. $600 a month, $700. One guy wanted $850, said that was the going rate now. Demand was up because so many farmers were losing their places and needed to store equipment off-site. Mike finally found a spot 30 miles away, a machine shed behind a fertilizer plant that rented space for $500 a month. Not a barn, not heated, but it had a roof and walls and a concrete floor. He arranged to rent a lowboy trailer, hired a guy with a semi to haul the tractors. The move cost $1,100, money he didn't have, money he had to borrow from the same line of credit he'd used for the turbocharger repair. The interest was accumulating like snow in a blizzard, piling up, making it hard to see where the ground was anymore. On March 15th, Mike drove out to Bud Keller's place for the auction. Half the county was there. Farmers and dealers and people who just came to watch other people's tragedies. The auctioneer stood on a flatbed trailer, voice amplified through speakers, selling off a lifetime of work piece by piece. 1975 John Deere 4430, he called out. 3,200 hours, runs good. Who'll start me at 20,000? The bidding was slow. People knew these were desperation sales. They waited, let the prices drop, picked up equipment for half what it was worth. Bud's tractor sold for $18,500. He'd paid $42,000 for it 7 years ago. Mike watched Bud standing off to the side, hands in his pockets, face expressionless. 68 years old and watching a lifetime of farming end in an afternoon. The house would go next month. The land would follow. Everything Bud's father and grandfather had built, gone because of decisions made in '75 when money was cheap and the future looked bright. After the auction, Mike found Bud by his truck, loading the few personal items the bank had let him keep. A toolbox, a coffee thermos, a jacket. "Where will you go?" Mike asked. Bud shrugged. "Got a sister in Des Moines. She says I can stay with her till I figure things out. I'm 68 years old and I'm moving in with my sister like I'm a kid again." "I'm sorry. Stop saying that. Everybody's sorry. Nobody can do anything about it, but everybody's sorry. You want to help me? Learn from this. Get out before it's too late." Mike drove home and the words followed him. Get out before it's too late. But how did you get out when you were already underwater? When selling the equipment meant taking a loss you couldn't afford? When keeping it meant payments you could barely make? He thought about his father, thought about walking across that quarter mile between their houses and saying the words that needed to be said. But every time he reached for the phone or put on his coat to make that walk, pride stopped him. Pride and shame and the knowledge that his father had been right about everything. April came and with it the need to plant. Mike hooked up the planter to one of the 4.640s, made the drive from the storage shed to the Morrison ranch, and started working the fields. The equipment performed flawlessly, just like it had the year before. The tractor was smooth and powerful, the planter precise, dropping seeds at exactly the right depth and spacing. But the drive was killing him. 60 miles round trip every day, 2 hours minimum, sometimes 3 if traffic was bad or weather slowed him down. The diesel cost was $15 a day, more than $400 a month just in fuel for driving back and forth. Added to the storage fee, he was spending $900 a month just to keep tractors he couldn't use without spending more money. The madness of it became clear in those April days, driving the same roads over and over, watching the odometer climb and the gas gauge drop. He'd bought the equipment to be more efficient, but he was spending a quarter of his time just getting to and from it. His father's old 4010 sat in the shed on the ranch, paid for and ready, but Mike's pride wouldn't let him ask to use it. May brought rain. Too much rain. The fields turned to mud and Mike couldn't get into them to finish planting. He lost a week, then another. When the ground finally dried enough to work, he was behind schedule, planting in conditions that weren't ideal, racing against the calendar. The stress was physical. He could feel it in his shoulders, in his neck, in the headaches that came most evenings and lasted into the night. He was 37 years old now and felt 50. Woke up tired, went to bed exhausted, spent every day in between trying to keep all the pieces from falling apart. The payment was due May 15th, $1,210. Mike wrote the check and realized his checking account was down to $1,800. After the payment cleared, he'd have $600 left. $600 between him and disaster. One equipment breakdown, one unexpected expense, one anything, and he was done. He needed the crop to come in good, needed yields to be strong and prices to be decent and weather to cooperate, needed everything to go right when nothing had gone right for a year. June arrived hot. Not as hot as the year before, but hot enough to stress the late planted corn. The plants grew, but slowly, unevenly. Mike walked the fields and saw problems everywhere. Patches where the seed hadn't germinated, areas where weeds were winning the fight, spots where the ground stayed too wet and the roots were rotting. This was supposed to be the year that saved him, the harvest that proved the equipment was worth it. But standing in the field on a June evening, watching the sun set red and angry through haze, Mike knew it wasn't going to happen. The corn wasn't going to save him. Nothing was going to save him except the one thing he couldn't bring himself to do. The second breakdown came in July. The planter this time, not the tractor. A bearing seized in the seed meter, destroying the mechanism that controlled seed spacing. The repair would cost $3,200. Mike didn't have $3,200. He went back to the bank, sat across from Warren Hastings again, asked for another short-term loan. Warren pulled up his file, looked at the screen for a long time before looking at Mike. "I can't do it," Warren said. "You're at your limit. Your debt-to-income ratio is too high. Another loan would put you in a position where default is almost certain. I need the planter to finish the crop. I understand, but I have to think about the bank's position. We're seeing default rates climb across the agricultural sector. We have to be careful. What am I supposed to do?" Warren took off his glasses and cleaned them with his tie. It was a gesture that gave him time to think, time to find words that wouldn't sound as harsh as they were. "Mike," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you. You're in trouble, deep trouble. Your equipment debt is $88,400. Your short-term debt is running close to $8,000. You're spending $900 a month on storage and transportation. Your last year's income was $36,000 before living expenses. The math doesn't work. Tell me something I don't know. Here's what I'm telling you. You need to liquidate, sell the equipment, take the loss, start over. The loss would be $30,000, at least, maybe more. I know. But if you keep going, the loss will be worse. This is financial triage. You cut off the limb to save the body. Mike left the bank and sat in his truck in the parking lot. Cut off the limb to save the body, sell the tractors, admit defeat, tell his father he was right, tell the whole county he was wrong, spend the next 5 years paying off a loss on equipment he didn't even own anymore. Or keep going. Find another way. Maybe borrow from somewhere else, someone else. Maybe the crop would come in better than expected. Maybe prices would rise. Maybe something would change. He chose maybe. Chose to keep going because stopping meant admitting everything his father had said was true, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. He found someone willing to fix the planter on credit. A small repair shop that didn't ask too many questions, just did the work and sent a bill with net 30 terms. Mike finished planting and told himself he'd figure out how to pay when the bill came due. August was hotter than July. The corn was short again, stressed again, yielding less than it should. Mike walked the rows and estimated 87 bushels per acre. Maybe 90 if he was lucky. He'd needed 110 to break even. 87 meant he was going to lose money. Not a little money, a lot of money. The corn price was down too, $1.95 per bushel. The market was flooded. Everyone's crop had suffered from the weather, but there was still too much supply and not enough demand. $1.95 per bushel meant his gross revenue would be around $122,000. Operating costs were running higher again, over $100,000 with all the extra driving and repairs and credit he'd used. He was going to net maybe $20,000 before loan payments. After loan payments, he'd be lucky to clear $6,000 for a year of work that had aged him 5 years. The night he finished his calculations, Mike didn't cry this time. He was too tired to cry, too empty. He just sat at the kitchen table and stared at the numbers until they blurred, and then he put his head down and slept right there. Forehead on the notepad, calculator digging into his arm. He woke at 3 in the morning, neck stiff, back aching. Outside, the world was dark and quiet. No moon, no stars, just darkness. He looked out the window toward his father's house and saw no lights. Hank would be asleep, probably sleeping soundly, the way men sleep when they don't owe anyone anything. Mike picked up the phone, put it down, picked it up again, dialed the first 3 digits of his father's number and stopped. What would he say? What words existed for this kind of surrender? He hung up the phone and sat in the dark and felt something break inside him. Not dramatically, just quietly, like a bone that's been under pressure too long finally giving way. He couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't keep pretending it was going to work out. Couldn't keep running numbers that didn't add up and making payments that left nothing behind. He needed help, needed his father, needed to cross that quarter mile and say words that tasted like poison but might save his life. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow I'll do it. But tomorrow came and his truck wouldn't start. Battery was dead. He borrowed a jump from a neighbor, got the engine running, and by the time he dealt with that small crisis, another had arrived. The storage facility called. They were raising rates to $600 a month. Take it or leave it. Mike took it because finding another place would cost time and money he didn't have. September brought harvest, the same custom cutter as the year before, rolling through the stunted corn, filling trucks with grain that Mike sold immediately because storing it cost money and waiting for better prices was a gamble he couldn't afford. 89 bushels per acre. Final yield. Corn sold at $190 per bushel. Gross revenue, $122,400. After costs and payments, net for the year $7,100. $7,100? A year of his life for $7,000. He'd spent more than that on gas just driving back and forth to the storage shed. The bill from the repair shop came in October. $3,200 due. Mike didn't have it. Called and asked for terms. They said no. Said they'd file a lien if he didn't pay within 30 days. Mike sold his pickup truck, the nice F-150 he'd bought in '76, back when he'd had steady work and a future. sold it for $4,000 to a dealer in town, bought a beat-up Chevy with 100,000 miles for $1,200, used the rest to pay the repair shop and cover living expenses. Now he drove a truck that burned oil and had a heater that didn't work right and made a noise like something was dying under the hood. Drove it 60 miles a day to use tractors worth $90,000. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. November came cold and early. First snow on the 10th. By Thanksgiving, the ground was frozen solid and the fields were white. Mike's father invited him for dinner, left a message on the answering machine. Just said, "You're welcome here if you want to come." Mike didn't go. Spent Thanksgiving alone with a frozen turkey dinner from the grocery store and the TV playing football games he didn't watch. Thought about his father eating alone too, probably the same frozen dinner, probably the same empty house. Two stubborn men, both alone, both too proud to cross a quarter mile. But something was changing in Mike. The breaking that had started in August was continuing, spreading, making it hard to hold on to the anger that had sustained him through the year. He was tired of being angry, tired of being alone, tired of fighting a fight he'd already lost. December brought the final piece of bad news. The bank called. Warren Hastings, professional as always, delivering terrible news in the calmest possible voice. "Mike," he said, "we need to discuss your loan status. You're current on payments, barely, but your overall financial position is concerning. We're going to require an annual review of your collateral and income." What does that mean? It means if we determine you're unable to sustain the debt service, we'll have to call the loan. You'd have 30 days to pay it off or we'd seize the collateral. You'd take the tractors, and possibly the land, depending on how the numbers work out. The loan was secured by both. Mike felt something cold settle in his chest. The land, his father's land, the 720 acres that Hank had spent 30 years accumulating, acre by acre, dollar by dollar, never borrowing, never risking. Mike had put it up as collateral without really thinking about what that meant. Now the bank was saying they might take it. "When's the review?" Mike asked. "January. After we see your year-end numbers." "They'll be bad." "I know. That's why I'm calling. I wanted you to have time to make arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Talk to your father, Mike. Whatever's between you two, it's not worth losing everything." Mike hung up the phone and stood in his kitchen, looking out at the frozen fields, at his father's house in the distance, at the life he'd tried to build and the disaster he'd made instead. He couldn't run anymore, couldn't hide behind pride or anger or the desperate hope that somehow things would turn around. The bank was coming. The debt was drowning him. And the only person who could help was the one person he had spent 18 months refusing to talk to. Mike put on his coat, walked out into the December cold, started across the quarter mile of frozen ground between his house and his father's. Each step was harder than the last. Each step felt like walking underwater, the weight of shame and failure making everything heavy. He was halfway there when he stopped, just stood in the middle of the frozen field, snow starting to fall around him, breath white in the cold air. What would he say? How did you tell your father he was right about everything? How did you ask for help when you'd thrown that help away 18 months ago? The snow fell harder. Mike stood there until he couldn't feel his feet anymore, and then he turned around and walked back to his house. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet, but soon, very soon, because the other option was losing everything. And maybe, just maybe, his pride wasn't worth that price anymore. The knock came on December 20th, 6 days before Christmas, at 7 in the morning when the sun was just starting to turn the eastern sky from black to gray. Mike Morrison was drinking coffee at his kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills he couldn't pay when he heard it. 3 sharp raps on the door. Deliberate. The sound of someone who wasn't going away. He opened the door and found his father standing there. Hank Morrison was 75 years old now, thinner than he'd been 18 months ago, moving a little slower. But his eyes were the same, clear and steady and looking right through whatever walls Mike had tried to build. "Can I come in?" Hank asked. Mike stepped aside. His father walked past him into the kitchen, looked around at the dishes in the sink and the bills on the table, and the general disorder of a man who'd stopped caring about small things. Hank didn't comment, just pulled out a chair and sat down. "Coffee?" Mike asked, because he didn't know what else to say. "Please." Mike poured a cup, set it in front of his father, then sat down across from him. They hadn't been in the same room since that April morning when the semi-truck had turned around. Hadn't spoken except for that one phone message about Thanksgiving. Now here they were, sitting at a table that had witnessed a lifetime of conversations, and neither one knew how to start. Hank broke the silence. Warren Hastings called me yesterday. Mike felt his stomach drop. Why would he call you? Because your loan was secured by land I still technically own. The transfer to you was conditional. I maintained oversight rights. Warren was letting me know they're considering calling the loan. Mike stared into his coffee. So I know you're in trouble. I knew you were in trouble the day those tractors arrived. I just didn't know how bad it would get. Pretty bad. How bad? Mike pulled the stack of bills toward him, spread them across the table like evidence at a trial. Equipment loan, $88,400 still owed. Short-term credit, $9,000 accumulated. Storage, 5 months behind. Repair bills, some paid, some not. Living expenses barely covered. Bank threatening to seize collateral. I'm drowning, Mike said, and I don't know how to stop. Hank picked up the bills one by one, reading them with the careful attention he gave to everything. His face showed nothing. No judgment, no satisfaction at being right, no emotion at all except maybe sadness. How much did you net this year, Hank asked. $7,000, before living expenses, on 720 acres. Yes, I netted $52,000 on the same acres, with equipment older than some of the men driving it. Mike felt the words like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. His father had worked the same land with paid-for equipment and made almost 8 times what Mike had made with brand-new tractors and modern techniques. I know, Mike said. I know I was wrong. Wrong isn't the problem. Everyone's wrong sometimes. The problem is you're drowning and you're too proud to grab the rope. What rope? There's no rope. The bank's going to take everything. Hank set down the last bill and looked at his son. His face was weathered from 75 years of sun and wind and hard work, but his eyes were gentle. I can buy the tractors, Hank said. Pay off your loan. Take ownership of them and sell them myself. You'll take the loss, probably $25,000 to $30,000, but you'll be out of debt. Mike felt something twist in his chest. You'd do that after everything? You're my son. I'd do a lot more than that. Why? Because I remember what it feels like to watch someone you love suffer because of debt. I watched it kill my father. I won't watch it kill my son. The silence stretched between them. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence and sat there, bright red against white snow, singing a song that sounded too cheerful for how Mike felt. There's a condition, Hank said. Of course there is. You come back to the ranch. You farm with my equipment. You learn to do it the right way. No more borrowing, no more gambling on new iron, just good farming with what we have. Mike wanted to argue, wanted to say something about independence, or making his own choices or being his own man. But the words died before they reached his mouth because he knew they were lies. He hadn't been independent. He'd been owned by the bank. He hadn't made his own choices. He'd made the choices debt forced him to make. Okay, Mike said. Okay? Yes, okay, I'll come back. I'll learn. I'll do whatever you say. Hank nodded slowly. We'll go to the bank tomorrow. Get the paperwork started. You'll sign the tractors over to me. I'll pay off the loan, then we'll sell them and settle up whatever's left. What about the other debt? We'll deal with it. One piece at a time. But first we stop the bleeding. They sat there for a while longer, not talking, just being in the same room together after so long apart. Mike felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, not relief, but something close to it. The feeling of not being alone anymore. His father stood up, moved slow because of his knees, put a hand on Mike's shoulder. It's good to have you back, son. Mike couldn't speak, just nodded. Watched his father walk to the door, put on his coat, step out into the cold December morning. After Hank was gone, Mike sat at the table and let himself cry. Not the desperate crying of someone who'd lost everything. The quiet crying of someone who'd been given a second chance he didn't deserve. The next day they drove to the bank together. Warren Hastings met them in his office, spread paperwork across his desk, explained the process. Hank would pay $88,400 to retire Mike's equipment loan. The tractors would transfer to Hank's name. Mike would be released from the debt, but would owe his father for the difference between what the tractors sold for and what Hank had paid. This is a gift, Warren said, looking at Mike. Not many fathers would do this. I know, Mike said. They signed the papers. Hank wrote a check that must have represented a significant portion of his savings. Didn't hesitate. Didn't make Mike beg. Just did what needed doing because that's who he was. 2 days later, Hank drove to the storage facility with a lowboy trailer he'd rented. They loaded both tractors, drove them back to the Morrison ranch, parked them in the equipment shed where they should have been all along. The tractors sat there, green and yellow and still nearly new, waiting for someone to buy them. Hank made calls, found a farmer in Nebraska who was expanding, had cash, wanted good equipment. They negotiated for 3 days, finally settled on $62,000 for both tractors, $26,400 less than Hank had paid the bank. The farmer came with a trailer the day after Christmas, loaded up the tractors and drove away, and Mike stood in the shed watching $92,000 worth of dreams disappear down the driveway. He should have felt devastated. Instead, he felt lighter. The weight was gone. The monthly payment was gone. The constant anxiety about making ends meet was gone. "You'll owe me $26,400, Hank said, standing beside him. "Pay it back when you can. No interest, no deadline, just when you can." Mike nodded. "I will. I promise." "I know you will." They walked back to the house together. The December sun was setting early, turning the snow orange and pink and purple. Beautiful and cold. Mike realized it was the first sunset he'd noticed in months. He'd been too busy surviving to see beauty. The short-term credit was harder to deal with. $9,000 spread across 3 different lenders. Hank didn't have that kind of cash available after buying and reselling the tractors. So Mike went to each lender and negotiated, explained his situation, asked for terms. 2 of them worked with him, extended the loans, lowered the interest, gave him breathing room. The third refused, wanted payment in full or they'd file a lien. Mike sold his old truck, the dying Chevy, for $800, borrowed $1,200 from his father, paid off that lender, and swore he'd never borrow again. January 1980 arrived cold and bitter, the kind of winter that made you wonder if spring was just a myth someone had invented to keep you from giving up. But Mike was working again, really working, not just surviving. He was back on the Morrison ranch, using his father's equipment, learning things he should have learned years ago. Hank taught him to rebuild an engine, to troubleshoot hydraulics, to maintain equipment so it lasted instead of just running it until it broke. They worked side by side in the shed while wind howled outside and snow piled against the walls. Hank's hands were gnarled with arthritis, but still steady, still sure. Mike watched and learned and felt something he'd forgotten. The simple satisfaction of fixing something instead of paying someone else to do it. "I rebuilt this 4010 twice," Hank said one morning, hands deep in the engine of the old tractor. 1968 and again in 76. Cost me about $1,400 each time. New tractor would have cost $50,000. I saved $47,200 by knowing how to do this myself. Mike held the trouble light while his father worked. The shed smelled like oil and diesel and cold metal. Good smells, honest smells. "Why didn't you ever teach me this before?" Mike asked. "I tried. You weren't interested. Too busy learning theories at college." "I was stupid. You were young. Same thing sometimes." They got the engine back together by late afternoon. Hank fired it up, and it ran smooth as silk. No knocks, no smoke, just the steady diesel rhythm that meant everything was right. Hank shut it down, and they stood there listening to it tick as it cooled. "That engine will outlive both of us," Hank said, "long as someone takes care of it." "I will," Mike promised. "I'll take care of it." February brought news from across the county. Interest rates were climbing again. Prime rate hit 15%. Banks were calling loans. Farmers who'd borrowed in the late 70s were finding their payments had doubled. Some were selling out. Some were walking away. Some were filing bankruptcy. Mike heard the stories at the feed store, at the diner in town, at church on Sunday. Names of families he'd known his whole life. Good people, hard workers, getting crushed because they'd believed the same lies he'd believed. That debt was a tool. That leverage was smart. That the boom would last forever. A farmer named Jim Holloway lost 400 acres his grandfather had homesteaded. Mike went to the auction, watched it happen. Jim stood off to the side with his wife and 3 kids, watching strangers bid on their life. The land sold for less than half what it was worth. The equipment sold for pennies on the dollar. Jim's wife cried. The kids looked confused. Jim just looked empty. Mike found him after the auction, shook his hand, said words that meant nothing because there were no words for this kind of loss. "Your old man was smart," Jim said, "keeping you out of debt. I wish my old man had done the same." Mike drove home and told his father about it. Hank was at the kitchen table doing paperwork, Wearing reading glasses he'd finally admitted he needed. There's going to be more, Hank said. This is just the beginning. The Fed's determined to break inflation even if it breaks agriculture in the process. How many will lose their farms? Hard to say. But anyone carrying heavy debt is vulnerable. Anyone who borrowed when rates were low is going to get crushed when it's time to refinance. I could have been Jim Holloway. You were Jim Holloway. For 18 months. You just got lucky. Had a father stubborn enough to save you from yourself. Mike sat down across from him. Dad, why didn't you just let me fail? Let me lose it all. Maybe I needed to learn that lesson. Hank took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked tired, older than 75. The last year had aged him too. Because some lessons kill you, Hank said. My father learned the debt lesson. It killed him. Not literally, but it killed something in him. He was never the same after we lost the farm. I wasn't going to let that happen to you, even though I didn't listen, especially because you didn't listen. That's what fathers do. We protect our sons even when they think they don't need protection, even when they hate us for it. I didn't hate you. Yes, you did. For a while, and that was okay. Better to be hated and have you alive than to be loved and have you destroyed. They sat in silence. Outside, the wind was picking up, driving snow against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Lonesome sound of winter and survival in the endless prairie. March brought a phone call that Mike wasn't expecting. Reverend Wade asking if Mike would be willing to talk to a young farmer who was in trouble. Guy named Terry Walsh, 32 years old, borrowed heavily in 78, now facing foreclosure. Mike drove to Terry's place on a Sunday afternoon. Found him in the barn, staring at equipment he couldn't pay for. 2 tractors, a combine, a grain truck, all financed, all about to be taken. Your dad said you might be able to help, Terry said. I don't know what I can do. I'm not a financial advisor. But you got out. That's what Reverend Wade said. You were in deep and you got out. Mike told him the story, all of it. The pride, the debt, the father who stood in the road, the 18 months of hell, the surrender, the recovery. Terry listened without interrupting. So I should sell, Terry said when Mike was done. Take the loss. That's what I'd do. The loss is going to hurt, but staying in will hurt more. My wife's family will never let me forget it. Her father lent us $50,000. We'll lose it all. Better to lose $50,000 now than $100,000 later. Terry walked outside, looked at his fields, looked at the house where his family lived. Mike could see what he was seeing, the end of something, the death of a dream. How do you live with it, Terry asked. Knowing you failed? Mike thought about that. Thought about the last 3 months. Working beside his father, learning things he should have known, finding a kind of peace he'd forgotten existed. You stop thinking of it as failure, Mike said. Start thinking of it as education. Expensive education, but education. And you use it. You teach your kids. You help other people avoid the same mistake. You turn the loss into wisdom. Terry nodded slowly. Then he shook Mike's hand and walked back to his house. Mike didn't know if the man would take his advice, but he'd done what he could. April came and Mike planted the fields using his father's equipment. The old 4010 that had been rebuilt twice. The old 4020 that was still going strong after 14 years. The planter that Hank had bought used in 1968 and maintained like it was made of gold. It was slower than the new equipment had been. No air conditioning, no stereo, no power steering. But it was paid for, and there was something deeply satisfying about that. About climbing onto a machine you owned outright. No bank holding the title, no monthly payment hanging over your head. The planning took longer than it would have with the 4640s, but Mike didn't mind. He had time now. Didn't have to rush because he wasn't trying to squeeze in 3 hours of driving every day. Just work steady, sunrise to sunset, got the job done. Hank watched from the porch sometimes, sitting in the old rocking chair he'd bought the year Ruth died, watching his son farm the land the way he'd farmed it, the right way, the slow way, the way that lasted. One evening, Mike came in from the field, found his father still on the porch. The sun was setting red and the air smelled like fresh turned earth and growing things. You did good today, Hank said. Thanks. How do you feel? Tired, but good tired, not stressed tired. That's the difference. Good tired means you accomplished something. Stressed tired means you're just surviving. Mike sat down on the porch steps. They watched the sun finish setting, watched the stars come out one by one in the darkening sky. I'm sorry, Mike said, for all of it, for not listening, for being so damn stubborn. You're my son. Stubborn comes with the territory. I almost lost everything you built, but you didn't. That's what matters. The fields were dark now, except for the lights from distant farmhouses. Somewhere a dog barked. A car passed on the county road, headlights sweeping across the land. Dad, Mike said, I want you to know something. I'll pay you back every dollar, however long it takes. I know you will, and I'll never forget what you did for me. Hank stood up, moved slow because his knees were bad, and the evening cold made them worse. He put a hand on Mike's shoulder. Just pay it forward, he said. When your son needs help, you help him. When someone else's son needs wisdom, you share it. That's how you pay me back. Mike nodded, watched his father go inside, sat on the porch alone and felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Gratitude. Simple, pure gratitude for a second chance and a father who loved him enough to fight for him even when he didn't want to be fought for. Summer came hot and dry, but not as brutal as the previous years. The corn grew steady, not spectacular, but solid. Mike walked the rows and saw healthy plants, good color, even growth. He didn't have the best equipment or the newest techniques, but he had something better. Low costs and no debt, and the freedom to farm for profit instead of farming to make payments. July brought a heat wave that pushed temperatures into the hundreds. The corn stressed but survived. Irrigation from the pond his grandfather had dug in 1940 helped. Conservative fertilizer application meant the plants weren't burning themselves up trying to process too much nitrogen. Mike worked with his father's methods now. Light touch on inputs, heavy focus on soil health, letting the land tell you what it needed instead of forcing it to do what you wanted. It was slower, yielded slightly less, but cost so much less that the profit was actually higher. August was when Mike started to believe it might actually work. The corn was setting good ears, the fields were clean, weeds were controlled, but not eliminated because Hank taught him that some weeds helped hold moisture and prevent erosion. Everything was balanced. Nothing was extreme. One evening in late August, Hank came to find Mike in the field. He walked slow across the rows, moving careful because his knees were getting worse. When he reached Mike, he was breathing hard. You okay, Mike asked. Fine, just getting old. You want to sit down? I want to tell you something. They walked to the truck, sat on the tailgate while the sun set and the heat finally broke. Hank was quiet for a long time, just sitting there and looking at the land he'd spent his life protecting. I'm proud of you, Hank said finally. The way you came back, the way you learned, the way you didn't let pride kill you. Mike didn't know what to say. His father wasn't a man who spoke emotions often. When he did, it meant something. I'm seeing the doctor next week, Hank continued. Heart's acting up. Nothing serious probably, but I'm 75. Time to make sure things are in order. Dad, you're going to be fine. Maybe, maybe not. Either way, I want you to know the land is yours, free and clear. Always was meant to be. I just had to make sure you understood what it meant to own it. I understand now. Good. Because this land, it's not just dirt and crops. It's legacy. It's what your grandfather built and what I protected and what you'll pass to your kids. But only if you protect it too. Only if you keep it free from debt. I will, I promise. They sat there until dark. Father and son, two men who'd almost lost each other. Two men who'd found their way back through pain and pride and eventually love. September harvest brought 95 bushels per acre. Not spectacular by modern standards, but solid, consistent, profitable. Corn prices had climbed a little, $2.30 per bushel. Mike sold most of it, kept some in storage betting on higher prices in spring. The math worked. Gross revenue, $157,680. Operating costs, $68,000. Net $89,680 before living expenses. After living expenses and paying his father back $5,000 toward the tractor debt, Mike netted $72,000. $72,000 on the same land where he'd netted $7,000 just 1 year earlier. Same acres, different approach. The difference was everything. Mike showed his father the numbers. Hank looked at them and nodded. That's good farming, he said. That's sustainable. I couldn't have done it without you. You did it yourself. I just showed you how. But the truth was more complicated than that. Mike had done the work, but his father had saved him, had given him the chance to do the work, had stood in that road 18 months ago and said no when everyone else was saying yes. October brought cold early. Frost hit on the 10th, earlier than usual. The fields went dormant. The work slowed. Mike spent his days maintaining equipment, fixing small things before they became big things, preparing for winter. On October 27th, on a gray afternoon when the wind carried the smell of coming snow, Hank Morrison collapsed in the barn. Mike found him lying on the concrete floor, pale and breathing shallow. He called an ambulance, rode with his father to the hospital in town, sat in the waiting room while doctors worked. The news was bad. Heart attack, serious. Hank was stable but weak. The doctor said recovery was possible but not guaranteed. At 75, with a heart that had been stressed for years, anything could happen. Mike sat beside his father's bed for 3 days. Hank was in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused. On the third day, in a moment of clarity, he opened his eyes and looked at his son. "The land," Hank whispered. "It's okay, Dad. Everything's okay. Protect it. I will. No debt. Never. I promise." Hank closed his eyes. His breathing was labored but steady. Mike held his hand and felt how thin it had become, how the bones showed through skin that seemed almost transparent. "You saved my life," Mike said, even though he didn't know if his father could hear. "You stood in that road and you saved my life. I know I didn't say it then. I'm saying it now. Thank you." Hank poised his hand. Just barely, but enough. Enough to say he heard. Enough to say he understood. Enough to say all the things they'd never been good at saying with words. On the fourth day, Hank opened his eyes one more time, looked at his son, smiled a little. "Good boy," he said. "You turned out okay." Then he closed his eyes and went to sleep. And this time he didn't wake up. Hank Morrison died on November 1st, 1980. The leaves were falling from the oak trees his grandfather had planted. The fields were bare and waiting for winter. The land he'd spent his life protecting passed to his son, free and clear, exactly as he'd wanted. The funeral was 3 days later. Half the county came. Veterans in uniform, farmers in their good suits, people who'd known Hank for 50 years, people who'd heard the story of the man who stood in the road and stopped a truck and saved his son. Reverend Wade spoke at the service, talked about stubbornness and love and the courage it takes to say no when everyone else is saying yes. Talked about legacy and land and what it means to protect something for the next generation. They buried Hank in the cemetery outside of town, next to Ruth, under a stone that said, "Hank Morrison, 1904 to 1980, he owed no man." Mike stood at the graveside after everyone else had left, looking at fresh earth and thinking about the last 2 years. The anger and pride, the debt and desperation, the salvation and redemption. His father had been right about everything, and it had taken Mike losing almost everything to figure that out. Some lessons were expensive, some were painful, some changed you forever. This one had done all three. Mike put his hand on the cold stone, made a promise to the man beneath it. "I'll protect the land. I'll stay out of debt. I'll teach my son what you taught me. I'll make you proud." The wind blew across the cemetery, rattling the dry leaves, carrying the smell of winter. Mike turned and walked back to his truck, drove home to 720 acres that were his now. All his, no bank, no debt, no one to answer to except himself and the ghost of a 75-year-old man who'd loved him enough to break his heart to save his soul. Some fathers let their sons fail. Hank Morrison had fought like hell to make sure failure wasn't an option. And in the end, that had made all the difference. The winter of 1980 to 81 was the coldest in 20 years. Temperatures stayed below zero for weeks at a time. The fields froze solid, the ground like iron under 2 feet of snow. Mike Morrison spent those months alone in the farmhouse, learning to live with silence and memory and the weight of land that was now entirely his responsibility. He paid off another $5,000 toward his debt to his father's estate in December, then another $5,000 in January. By spring of 81, he'd reduced what he owed to $16,400. Still a mountain, but smaller than it had been. Manageable. Every payment felt like progress. Every dollar less owed felt like breathing easier. The farm crisis that had started as a trickle in 79 became a flood in 81. Interest rates hit 21.5% in June. Agricultural land values dropped 20% in a single year. Banks that had been eager to lend in 78 were now desperate to call in loans. Across Iowa, across the Midwest, across rural America, foreclosure signs went up like grave markers. Mike watched it happen from the safety of debt-free ground, watched neighbors lose farms their grandfathers had homesteaded, watched auction after auction, families leaving land they'd worked for generations. Every time he saw it, he thought about his father standing in that road, stopping that truck, saving him from this. In March of '81, a young farmer named David Brenner called. He was 28 years old, married with 2 kids and drowning in debt. He'd heard Mike's story from Reverend Wade, wanted advice. They met at the diner in town. David looked exhausted, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. He laid out his situation: 240 acres, financed equipment, operating loans at 18%, no way to make the payments with corn at $2 a bushel. What should I do? David asked. Mike told him the truth. Sell everything, take the loss, start over with nothing. It's going to hurt. It's going to feel like dying, but it's better than the alternative. What's the alternative? Losing everything anyway, but 3 years from now when you're even deeper. Watching the bank auction off your kid's future. David's eyes were wet. My wife's going to leave me. Maybe. But she'll definitely leave you if you keep drowning and take her down with you. David sold out 2 months later. Lost $40,000. His wife didn't leave, but Mike heard they moved to Des Moines, where David got work at a factory. Sometimes salvation looked like defeat. Sometimes the only way to win was to quit before the game killed you. Spring came late in '81, but it came. Mike planted with his father's old equipment, taking his time, doing it right. The work was therapeutic. Sunrise to sunset, hands on machinery, feet on earth, mind focused on tasks that had clear beginnings and endings. He was 37 years old and farming alone for the first time in his life. No father looking over his shoulder. No one to ask when things got confusing. Just him and 720 acres and the accumulated wisdom of 2 men who'd learned farming the hard way. The crop was good that year. Not spectacular, but solid. 98 bushels per acre. Corn prices stayed depressed at $2.10, but Mike's costs were low enough that he still netted $68,000. He paid his father's debt down to $6,000, saved the rest, started thinking about the future instead of just surviving the present. In August, Reverend Wade asked if Mike would be willing to speak at the church's men's breakfast. Talk about debt and farming and lessons learned. Mike said yes, even though public speaking terrified him. Felt like he owed it to his father's memory. 20 men showed up on a Saturday morning in the church basement. Farmers mostly, ranging from their 30s to their 70s. Mike stood at the front and told them everything. The pride, the debt, the desperation, the father who saved him, the lessons that cost almost everything to learn. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then an older farmer, maybe 70, stood up. I told my son the same thing your father told you, the old man said. He didn't listen either. Lost his farm last year. Wish I'd been as stubborn as Hank Morrison. Wish I'd stood in the road. Other men spoke, shared their stories. Some had stayed out of debt and survived. Some had borrowed and lost everything. Some were still fighting, still trying to make payments that kept growing while crop prices kept falling. After the breakfast, 3 young farmers asked if Mike would be willing to mentor them, show them how to farm without debt, teach them what Hank had taught him. Mike said yes, started spending evenings and weekends helping other men avoid the mistakes he'd made. It became a kind of mission, a way to honor his father. Every young farmer Mike helped stay out of debt was a small victory against the system that had almost destroyed him. Every piece of wisdom he shared was his father's voice, living on, protecting sons Mike would never meet. 1982 was worse than '81. More foreclosures, more auctions, more families leaving land they loved. Mike's farm stayed stable, 92 bushels per acre, $2.20 per bushel. Net $58,000 after a dry summer stressed the crop. He paid off the last $6,000 he owed his father's estate. Owned the land free and clear now. All of it, no debt to anyone. That fall, he bought a used John Deere 4430, 1976 model, 6 years old, 4,200 hours. Not new, not perfect, but solid and reliable. Paid $28,000 cash. Took him 2 years of saving, but when he drove it onto the ranch, it was his, completely his. The title had his name and no bank's name, and that made it worth more than any new tractor could ever be. Winter of '82 brought a blizzard that shut down the county for 3 days. Mike spent those days in the house, going through his father's papers, finding things he'd never seen. Letters Hank had written but never sent. Financial records going back to 1946. A journal from 1932, written in a boy's hand, describing the day the bank took the farm. Mike read his father's words from 50 years ago. Today they took everything. Papa didn't fight. Just watch them load the furniture and drive away. I will never let this happen to me. I will never owe anyone. I will die first. Hank had kept that promise, had died debt-free, had passed on land that was clean and clear and unburdened. The greatest inheritance wasn't the acres. It was the wisdom, the understanding that true wealth wasn't what you owned, but what you didn't owe. 1983 brought the worst of the farm crisis. The papers called it a depression in agriculture. Corn prices fell to 180. Land values dropped another 25%. Banks failed. Whole towns died as main streets emptied and businesses closed. Mike survived because his costs were so low he could make money at 180. Not much money, but enough. That year he netted $38,000, put most of it in savings, started thinking about the future in decades instead of seasons. In June of '83, he met a woman named Ann Webster at a county extension office seminar on farm management. She was 34, never married, worked as an agricultural economist for the Extension Service. Smart, practical, with eyes that understood numbers and a heart that understood people. They talked after the seminar about debt loads and survival strategies and the future of small farms. Exchanged phone numbers. Started having coffee once a week, then twice, then whenever they could find time. By September, they were dating. By Christmas, he'd asked her to marry him. She said yes, with one condition. Show me the books. Show me every dollar you owe, every dollar you make, every decision you have made since your father died. Mike showed her everything. The debt he had accumulated and paid off, the equipment he'd bought with cash, the savings he was building, the land that was free and clear. Anne read through it all, did calculations on a yellow notepad, looked at him with respect. You did it right, she said, after you learned the hard way. Most men never learn. They just keep making the same mistakes until the mistakes kill them. My father taught me. Your father saved you. They married in April of '84 in a simple ceremony at the church. Reverend Wade officiated. 30 people attended. No debt was incurred. No money was borrowed. They paid cash for everything and started their marriage the way Mike now did everything. Free and clear. Anne moved into the farmhouse that summer, brought her own furniture, her own savings, her own practical wisdom about money and life. She kept her job at the extension office, helping farmers understand their finances, teaching the same principles Hank had lived by. Together, they made $80,000 that year, saved $40,000 of it. In October of '84, they bought another 80 acres from a foreclosing neighbor, paid cash, $42,000. The neighbor cried when they closed the deal, not because he was sad to sell to Mike, but because he was grateful someone would take care of land his family had worked for 80 years. Mike promised he would, promised to farm it right, protect it, pass it on to the next generation the way it had been passed to him. 1985 was the year the farm crisis finally peaked. Over 200,000 farms foreclosed nationwide. In Iowa alone, 18% of farms disappeared. Towns died, schools closed, rural America was bleeding out, and nobody in Washington seemed to care enough to stop it. But Mike and Ann survived, more than survived, thrived. They farmed 800 acres now, all paid for, with equipment that was used but reliable and costs that were low enough to make money even when corn was selling for $190. In December of '85, Ann told him she was pregnant. Mike felt something shift in his chest. A son, a daughter, someone to pass the land to, someone to teach, someone to protect from the mistakes he'd made. What if they don't listen? He asked Ann. What if they're like me? Then you'll stand in the road, she said, like your father did, and you'll save them whether they want to be saved or not. His son was born in August of 1986. They named him Henry Morrison after Hank. Called him Hank from the first day. A 7-pound gift with his grandfather's gray eyes and a cry that said he was already stubborn. Mike held his son in the hospital and made the same promise his father had made holding him. This boy would inherit land, not debt, would learn that some things were worth protecting, even if it meant saying no to dreams that glittered like gold, but cut like glass. The late '80s brought slow recovery. Corn prices climbed to $240, then $260. Land values stabilized. The bleeding stopped, though the scars remained. Everywhere Mike looked, he saw empty houses, fallow fields, families that were gone and never coming back. He farmed through it, teaching young Hank to walk the rows, to ride on the tractor, to understand that land was sacred and debt was death. The boy was too young to understand the words, but he'd grow into them. Mike had time. 1990 brought new challenges. Environmental regulations, changing markets, corporate farms buying up land from families that couldn't hold on any longer. But Mike adapted, kept his costs low, farmed conservatively, stayed out of debt. He bought another used tractor in 92. 1983, John Deere 4440, 9 years old, paid cash, $31,000. His equipment roster now included tractors from 76 and 83, both paid for, both maintained like they were made of gold. Young Hank was 6 now, riding with his father during planting and harvest, learning by watching and listening. Mike taught him to change oil, to grease fittings, to respect machinery and the work it did. Taught him that new wasn't always better, and that the best investment was the one you could pay for outright. The 90s were good years. Corn prices stayed reasonable. Yields improved as farming techniques got better. Mike and Ann expanded slowly, buying 80 acres in 94, another 160 in 97. All cash, all planned, and all protected from debt. By 2000, the Morrison Ranch had grown to 1,040 acres. Mike was 56 years old, still farming, still teaching his son, still helping young farmers avoid the mistakes that had almost killed him 20 years earlier. The 2000s brought new equipment temptations: GPS-guided tractors, precision agriculture, computer-controlled planters. Dealers called constantly, offering financing, promising efficiency. Mike said no to all of it, kept his used equipment, kept his costs low, kept his freedom. Young Hank went to Iowa State in 2004, studied agricultural economics like his father had, came home in 2008 with a degree in ideas and the same eager ambition Mike had brought home 30 years earlier. They sat on the porch one evening in June, watching the sun set over fields that were now fourth-generation Morrison land. "Dad," Hank said, "I want to modernize, new equipment, precision agriculture. We could increase yields 15%. Mike felt something familiar, an echo of a conversation from 30 years ago. Different people, same dangerous ideas. "How much would it cost?" Mike asked. $300,000. We could finance it over 10 years. Payment would be about $4,000 a month. Mike was quiet for a long time. Hank waited, probably thinking his father would say yes because this was different, this was smarter, this was the modern way. "No," Mike said. "Dad, come on. This isn't 1978. Interest rates are low. The market's stable." That's what they said in 78. That's what the dealer told me. That's what I believed until I was drowning. "But you're being irrational. You're letting fear from 30 years ago control decisions today." Mike stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, looked out at land that had cost him almost everything to keep. "Let me tell you a story," he said, and he told his son everything. The whole truth. The debt, the desperation, the father who stood in the road, the years of hell, the salvation, the lessons learned in blood and tears and shame. Hank listened. When Mike was done, the boy was crying. "I didn't know," Hank said. "You never told me all of it." "Because some things are hard to talk about. But you need to know. You need to understand why I'm saying no. Not because I'm old and afraid, because I'm old and wise. There's a difference." "What if I want to do it anyway?" Mike felt his father's words rise in his throat. "Then you'll do it somewhere else. Not on this land. Not with the legacy your grandfather died protecting." Hank was quiet. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, we'll do it your way." "It's not my way. It's the only way that works when everything else falls apart." They farmed together through the next decade, father and son, using paid-for equipment, keeping costs low, making steady profit year after year. Hank learned patience, learned that slow and steady beat fast and reckless, learned that his father's wisdom wasn't fear but survival instinct honed by experience. The financial crisis of 2008 could have destroyed them. Corn prices spiked to $7 in the boom, then crashed to $3.50 in the bust. Farmers who'd expanded during the spike, borrowed against inflated land values, bought new equipment on credit, found themselves underwater when the market collapsed. Mike and Ann watched it happen again. Different year, different crisis, same lesson. Debt killed, freedom saved. They netted $80,000 in 2008 when others were filing bankruptcy, not because they were smarter or luckier, because they didn't owe anyone anything. In 2010, Mike handed the operation to Hank. He was 66, ready to step back, trust his son to carry it forward. Hank was 34, married now with 2 kids of his own, and farming with the same principles his grandfather had died protecting. Mike and Ann moved into town, bought a small house near the church close to friends and memories. But Mike went back to the ranch most days, walked the fields, visited his father's grave, stood sometimes in the middle of the gravel drive where Hank had stood in April of '78, stopping a truck and saving a life. Young farmers still called him, still asked for advice. Mike always said yes, always told the story, always honored his father's memory by helping other sons avoid the mistakes he'd made. In 2015, Hank's daughter, Mike's granddaughter, turned 10. Her name was Ruth after her great-grandmother. Mike taught her to drive the old 4010, the tractor his father had rebuilt twice, the tractor that had seen 55 years of service and was still running strong. "You're driving history," Mike told her. "Your great-great-grandfather bought this tractor in 1960. It was already old then. Now it's 2015 and it still works. You know why?" "Why?" Ruth asked. "Because we took care of it. Because we didn't run it into the ground trying to squeeze every dollar out of it. Because we respected what it gave us and gave back maintenance and care." Ruth drove slow across the field, learning to feel the machine, learning the rhythm of farming that didn't depend on computers or GPS, but on understanding and attention and respect. By 2020, the Morrison Ranch was 1,200 acres, all paid for, all protected, all passed down through 5 generations without ever being mortgaged or endangered by debt. The COVID pandemic disrupted everything in 2020. Supply chains broke. Prices fluctuated wildly. Equipment became scarce and expensive. Farmers who'd leveraged themselves during the good years found themselves unable to make payments when the world shut down. Mike was 76 now, retired but still watching, still helping, still teaching. He saw it happen again. Different crisis, same pattern. Debt trapped, freedom saved. In 2023, a young farmer named Jason Cooper called. He was 30, 3 years into farming, 50,000 in debt on equipment, and terrified. They met at the same diner where Mike had met David Brenner 42 years earlier. Different decade, different people, same story. Mike told him everything, showed him the path out, offered to help. "How do you live with it?" Jason asked. "Knowing you almost lost everything?" Mike smiled. Same question Terry Walsh had asked in 1980. Same answer. "You stop thinking of it as failure. You start thinking of it as education. And you use it. You teach others. You save sons from making the same mistakes their fathers made." Jason followed Mike's advice, sold his equipment, took the loss, started over with used machinery and no debt. 3 years later, he was thriving, farming 400 acres and sleeping at night. Now in 2024, Mike Morrison is 80 years old. He sits on his porch in town and watches the world change. Watches equipment get bigger and more expensive. Watches dealers offer financing that looks attractive until you read the terms. Watches young farmers make the same mistakes he made 46 years ago. And he speaks when they'll listen, tells the story when they'll hear it, honors his father's memory by protecting sons and daughters from debt that glitters like opportunity but cuts like a knife. Hank Jr. runs the ranch now. 48 years old, farming with used equipment, keeping costs low, making steady profit, teaching his own kids the same lessons. Ruth is 19 now, studying agricultural economics at Iowa State. Her younger brother, William, is 16 and already knows he wants to farm. The land is safe, protected, free, exactly as Hank Morrison wanted it when he stood in that gravel drive in 1978 and stopped a truck with nothing but his will and his love. On warm summer evenings, Mike drives out to the ranch, walks the fields, stands sometimes in the middle of that drive and remembers the anger, the pride, the desperation, the salvation, the father who loved him enough to break his heart to save his soul. Hank Morrison died 43 years ago, but his wisdom lives on in land that's never been mortgaged, in tractors that are old but paid for, in a family that understands that true wealth isn't measured in acres or equipment, but in freedom from debt and the peace that comes with it. Mike visits his father's grave once a week. The stone is weathered now, the letters worn by 40 years of Iowa weather. But the words are still clear. Hank Morrison, 1904 to 1980, he owed no man. Mike stands there and talks to the stone like it can hear him. Tells his father about the ranch, about Hank Jr., about the young farmers he's helped. Tells him about Ruth learning to drive the old 4010. tells him the land is safe. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the oak trees his great-grandfather planted, Mike hears something that sounds like his father's voice. "Good boy, you did good." The Morrison Ranch is still operating. 1,200 acres. Fifth generation, completely debt-free. It survived the farm crisis of the 80s, the recession of 2008, the pandemic of 2020. It will survive whatever comes next because the lesson has been learned and passed down and protected. Debt is death. Freedom is life. Pride costs everything. Humility saves you. Some lessons you learn by being told. Some you learn by watching. Some you learn by almost losing everything that matters and having a father who loves you enough to stand in a road and say no when everyone else is saying yes. Mike Morrison learned the hard way, but he learned. And now, 46 years later, he teaches, honors his father, protects the legacy, saves sons from drowning in debt that promises prosperity but delivers only chains. On April 22nd, 2024, exactly 46 years after Hank Morrison stood in that road, Mike drives out to the ranch, parks his truck at the spot where the semi had stopped, walks to the middle of the gravel drive where his father stood. He's 80 years old now. His knees hurt, his back aches, but he stands straight, remembering a 74-year-old man who refused to move, refused to bend, refused to let his son make a mistake that would destroy him. The oak trees are bigger now. The fields are the same. The land endures. Mike stands there for a long time, feeling the Iowa sun warm on his face, listening to the red-tailed hawk that circles overhead, thinking about legacy and love and the courage it takes to save someone from themselves. "Thank you, Dad," he says to the empty road, "for standing here, for stopping me, for loving me enough to let me hate you." The wind blows through the trees. The hawk cries out. The land waits, patient and eternal, for the next generation to learn what every generation must learn. That true wealth isn't what you own. It's what you don't owe. And some debts can never be repaid, except by passing the lesson forward, except by standing in the road when your own son needs stopping, except by loving enough to break hearts in order to save souls. Mike Morrison walks back to his truck, drives home, sits on his porch and watches the sun set over a town that has survived because some men were stubborn enough to say no when everyone else was saying yes. And somewhere, in a cemetery outside of town, under a weathered stone, Hank Morrison rests easy. His land is safe. His son survived. His legacy endures. He owed no man, and he taught his son to owe no man. And the lesson continues, generation after generation, free and clear, forever.